Hello everybody and welcome back to the course on action research on children at risk in community context. This is the week 2 lecture and today's focus is on what is the action research process. The main objective of this course is to introduce you to action research as well as to guide you to do an action research project. Well, let's do a quick review of last week, week 1. We looked at what is action research last week, and we surveyed the works of Patrick Costello's action research, David Greenwood and Morton Levin's work, Introduction to Action Research, and also Jean McNiff and Jack Whitehead's work, All You Need to Know About Action Research and Introduction. In summary, some of the key ideas we looked at were: Number 1, that action research is primarily done by practitioners. Number 2, it entails both action in the world to effect social change as well as research to produce knowledge. Number 3, it includes stakeholders. So it's not just a distanced approach, but it's a collaborative approach including stakeholders and who make a contribution to knowledge. And finally, the outcomes of doing this research are not just research works, but equally action in the world to bring about social change. Well, today's topic is a continuation of what we did last week. And today we ask the question, so what is the action research process? This week, we have once again 3 key texts. Number 1, Richard Sadgor's How to Conduct Collaborative Action Research, published in 1992 by Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. We once again have Jean McNiff and Jack Whitehead's another work titled Action Research, Principles and Practice, published by Routledge in 2002. And finally, Jack Chevalier and Daniel Buckle's work, Participatory Action Research, Theory and Methods for Engaged Inquiry, published once again by Routledge in 2013. So now, what is action research process? I want to share with you how the process of AR works practically, so that even as you listen, you can begin to imagine how you can apply it for your own project. So the strategy in this lecture is slightly different from the last, in that I'm going to share my application of action research in a project that I was involved with. However, I do expect you to do the readings, even as you discover what the readings entail with regard to the action research process, and so that you can also write out your discussion and dialogue posts on Moodle. Towards the end of this talk today, I will introduce the 3 key readings. But before we get on to action research, let's talk a bit generally about research itself. In my view, and most literature on research and research methods would agree, that fundamentally a research project has got 3 elements. Number 1, it begins with a research question. Now, this research question, particularly for action research, originates in the lived world, in the organization, in a community, in the real world. But because we are doing research, from this lived real world, we move to the world of text. So you have an understanding of a particular discipline you're part of. You have an understanding of a particular discourse. And you look for the theme that has risen for you from the real world, and you do a literature review. Even as you study the theme in the different literature, constrained by the particular discipline within which you are researching it, you will find that there are different schools of thought about the theme. You will find different schools of thought that probably even disagree with each other. And there is a debate. Got to pay attention to the debate, because that debate will actually give you your research question. So that's how we get an academic research question, which arises out of the literature. Although initially all of this came from the ground where you recognized a problem. The second component of research is that now that once we have got a research question, we need to look for answers to our question. So where we go to look for answers is called the object of research. Some people call it the source or sources. Some use the language of primary data, but that's technicalities. So let's use the term object of research. So object of research is where you go to get answers. So in the action research context, it's the community which contains the children at risk. Or the community that you're studying could be a religious community, a church with a project, an NGO, an FBO doing a project, or maybe you yourself are involved directly with the community which has children at risk. Now, that place and the work that's happening there is indeed going to produce and provide for you answers to the research question you raise. With action research, it's not a form of a mere qualitative research which is going to objectively study this object of research to get answers, but it is to collaboratively work together with the stakeholders to get the answers. But to know the field, the object that you're going to study is of utmost importance. So for you, like I mentioned last week, you need to be thinking of your particular specific object of research, the project, a situation which involves children at risk. The third component, now that we have a research question, we also have a place to go and get answers. How are we going to do it? And that is called the methodology. And for us, it's very clear what our methodology is. It is a form of action research, participatory action research. Now, there are various models of action research within action research itself, as well as largely within the human sciences. There are lots of methods and methodologies. But within action research, as you do your readings, you're going to come up with your design of what you think is going to work for you. What methodology will work best for you within action research. So largely, these are the three components: a research question coming out of academic literature, an object of research that will provide answers, and a methodology which will enable you to do the research. Now let's very quickly come to action research itself and my experience of it. So for me, when I did a project for World Vision, I was involved in doing an action research project amongst an NGO called Shiksha Rath based in Delhi. You can find details about them on the website. Their address is www.shiksha.org. And we used this methodology of action research to actually produce a practitioner's handbook for World Vision. So I want to share with you how the project developed in its various stages. And by sharing my experience, hopefully you will be able to get an overview of the action research process, and which will enable you to begin to think of designing your own project. But to begin with, just like you have certain course constraints, I too had some constraints for the research that came from World Vision. First of all, the goal was to look at the role of faith in development. In other words, when development work is being done, what is the role of religion and faith? Secondly, there was an interest to look at interfaith collaboration, because World Vision's development work was being done in interreligious, multi-religious context of India. Thirdly, it very specifically we were interested in how could an FBO, a faith-based organization, probably a Christian NGO with Christian development workers, when they work amongst a Hindu community, then how should they do holistic child development? Fourthly, we also wanted to do some positive change to Shiksha Rath, even as we research them. And finally, we wanted to make sure that the children that Shiksha Rath had was also benefited from the research we did. So these were some of the general constraints we had in mind even before we started the project. For you, your constraints, simply put, is that you're going to be looking at a project with children at risk, with a community, in a community context, and hopefully stemming out of where you are already working at, the place you're working with, or a project you're involved with. Okay, so what were the steps we followed? What were the different stages we followed? Firstly, we began with a preliminary research. It was a survey research to find out what the problem on the ground was. We wanted to find out a precise problem with Shiksha Rath that we wanted to address for research and also help resolve in the life of the organization. Now, it's important to find one problem. There are problems, and one research journey cannot solve all the problems in the world. So it's important to identify a precise problem. And for us, the problem was about how a Christian agency could work with the Hindu community and its children towards holistic children's development. So the problem was that when we studied and did our preliminary interviews, looked at the documentation, talked to the staff, we found out that there was a disjunction between what was stated in their vision statements and their documentation and what was actually happening on the ground. As a Christian organization, they had a strong faith component to their development work on paper, in their documents, while in actual practice, they were just doing a fantastic job, but of pure development. They did not really engage with faith matters. Now that was a problem for them. They realized it, and so did we. And we were able to flag it up. And they were now interested. And they said, okay, how can you help us to fulfill our own vision? Now that opened the door for us to research and also actively bring about some change in Shiksha Rath. Secondly, now that we understood the problem, we defined research objectives. We had three main objectives that came out of this preliminary research. Number one, we wanted to find out in terms of research that in the Indian context, how could FBOs bring faith into their development work by doing interfaith collaborative work, particularly with Hindu communities on holistic child development. This was our central research question: faith and development in the particular context of India. Secondly, we wanted to write out a research paper for sure, but we also wanted to write our research up as a practitioner's handbook. So the interventions we were going to bring to Shiksha Rath, the work we were going to do with Shiksha Rath, we did not want that to just be for the sake of research, but how could we use those to actually form practitioners' handbook lessons so that any FBO could actually use those lessons to train the development workers to do faith-based work in a Hindu context. Thirdly, we wanted to get Shiksha Rath to fulfill its vision of doing holistic child development with the faith component and enable its staff and its different stakeholders, the community members, the families, the children, to practically implement a collaboration so that the Christian development worker and the Hindu community together can bring faith into the development work they're doing with their children. So these were our three main objectives. As you can see, one is of research, the second is a practitioner's handbook, which is kind of an outcome, a non-research outcome, and thirdly, a very practical organizational change in the life of Shiksha Rath. So the third stage for us, after we had identified the problem, we had set out our research objectives, was to do a literature review on faith and development. So we asked the question generally about all development work. We went into the literature on development and asked and looked particularly at holistic development and asked the question, how whole with the W is holistic with an H development? How whole is holistic development? And this was interesting because we found that there was a debate between a neoliberal position and a post-development position. The neoliberal position actually was part of a secular worldview, and it understood development in materialistic, scientific terms, in a very economic sense. If there are people sick, then bring about hospitals. If they are illiterate, bring schools. How many number of children went to school? How many of them got vaccinations? So it was very clear, objective, and it looked at the material bodily welfare of the children. On the other hand, the post-development school, they romanticized the local tradition, the community, their historical legacies, their traditions, their religious worldviews, and said that they don't need these interventions from development agencies, but that they have resilience and they have a power to change from within. But unfortunately, there were not too many examples of these poor, downtrodden communities relying on their own historical resources who were able to truly bring about change, particularly material change, amongst themselves. So there were these two groups of scholars and two intellectual positions in the literature. One was very material and the other one was kind of spiritual, romantic, and did not really do anything on the ground. And when we looked at this, we realized very quickly that Shiksha Rath, although it claimed to be religious and it had a faith component in its vision statement, for all practical purposes, was following a purely secular model, a material model. It was doing great stuff for the health of the children, of the community, for their education, for their literacy, for their skill development, for employment, a lot of activities. But they were all tangible, material work done for economic welfare of the children. We also found out that the stakeholders, the parents, the families, the community members, and the development workers, all of them, including the children, had the same vision. They wanted economic upliftment. But there's nothing wrong with that, except that Shiksha Rath's vision was holistic transformation, holistic child development, which was beyond the purely material, which also wanted to address spiritual and other issues. However, that did not find space in the current plan of action of Shiksha Rath. So this made us to think deeper now. So it's all stemming out of the literature review. So I want to encourage you, even if you're doing an action research, do a fantastic research in terms of literature review. Because that is what's going to make you think through some of the problems. It's going to give you your ammunition, as it were, so that when you actually get to work on the community, you have those ideas floating in your head. You have those thoughts. You've read about those concepts. And it's easy for you to then analyze and understand what's happening on the ground. Of course, the ground is also going to give you new data, new understanding, and we are very much open to it. So once we realized that Shiksha Rath was not actually fulfilling its faith component, it was following a secular, a neoliberal agenda, we could locate it in terms of the literature, in terms of what its problems were. But then we started to read further. So what is the limitation of a secular worldview, a secular ideology? We found out that while it majors on techne or technical skills, theoria or science or on knowledge, but when it comes to phronesis or wisdom or application of knowledge in real world, then the inspirations, the aspirations, the decision-making process of a child and the practical use of knowledge for well-being, all of this comes from one's beliefs, one's core values. And this secular worldview often did not supply these important ingredients that would enable a child to use their education well for themselves. I mean, we find this all around us. If secular education in itself was the end, then everyone getting a good school education should do very well in life. But you and I know that that is not the case. What makes an individual have their inner motivations? What makes them choose one versus the other? On what values does someone take their decisions? These values, these fundamentals, these foundations of one's life often comes from the religious traditions that their family holds on to. The narratives, the stories, the characters they've heard about from their childhood. The people they have looked up to. The giants that they have adored and the gods they have worshipped. And now a secular frame which rejects these religious traditions, which rejects the role of the family, cuts off the foundation upon which its knowledge can be nurtured and applied. Now for us in our research, we thought this was the incredible insight we found, which resonated very well with what was happening at ground level. On one hand, Shiksha Rath and its passionate development workers were pouring out their lives into these children. And while some children responded positively, many of them, we could say, including their parents, were apathetic. And that made us wonder, why are they not owning it? Why are they not feeling empowered and using this as a ladder? We realized it was not just the program or the education, but it was their worldview, their mindset. And that brought faith and religion back into the game. So we realized that religious traditions can offer correctives to the secular education the child receives, particularly the religious traditions of the development worker and their families. this opened the door for us to talk about how religious traditions, Christian and Hindu, offer correctives to the secular tradition with regard to holistic child development by bringing faith to secular development through the involvement of family. So we have finally got at the heart of what we wanted to do. Now that we have conceptually understood not just the problem, but also the issues involved, and the literature review gave us insights and, in a sense, a way forward. It's all great theory unless it works on the ground. Therefore, we chose action research as our methodology. So the fourth stage was to design an action research project. Our stakeholders were the Shiksha Rath development workers, the Shiksha Rath community, the Hindu community in Delhi, the parents, the community elders, and finally the children. And when we talked about the action research model, we kind of followed McNiff in a very broad sense. Observe, reflect, plan, act, and then observe again, reflect, plan, and act. And this cycle is what we followed, but we improvised it. We made this 4 into actually 7 different stages, but broadly they would all fall into these 4 stages of a cycle. So we then designed cycles of intervention to bring about change. Now these cycles of intervention each cycle consisted of us working with the Shiksha Rath development workers, who in turn worked with the community and the children, and then they would review it, evaluate it, and give us feedback. And based on their feedback, we would once again design a second cycle. And we would intervene by bringing the resources to the development workers and listing out action plans. And then once that was done, they would take it and implement it in the community with the children, get their feedback, they would take records, and they would bring it back to us. And we would, on the basis of their review and evaluation, we would review that and we would design the next cycle. We did quite a few cycles in about 3 months. Now for your work, for this particular project that you're doing, I'm suggesting to do just 3 cycles. But okay, what did we do in our cycles? The first cycle was just understanding the problem and the limitations of secular education and a way forward. So all the stuff, the literature that we had read, the way we understood the problem, all of us, all the stakeholders had to be on the same page. If they didn't think it was a problem, then there was nothing to be resolved. So we already knew that the leadership of Shiksha Rath saw the disjunction between the vision and their work. But then the development workers, the staff, they had to see it. The community had to see it. The children had to see it. So that was our first cycle, that we devised a way for all the stakeholders to understand the problem and to look for a way beyond it. The second cycle consisted of how could our religious traditions now play a role in overcoming the limitations of the secular model of education that their kids are receiving, and yet aspire towards the success that the secular model entailed. If you let go of that, then everyone's going to lose interest. Sure, even we wanted success, but all we were saying is we want a holistic success. We believe that true economic success comes when the spiritual issues are addressed as well. So it was in this form that we were able to create the need to bring in the role of religion and family in holistic child development. The third cycle was we began to explore how does a Hindu tradition the traditions of the community, what stories, narratives they have that would inspire the children, that would give values to the children, that would enable the children to understand success beyond a mere economic and material sense. But equally, it gave the opportunity for the development worker to talk about his Christian worldview and understanding of holistic development. The stories and narratives and characters from the Christian texts that could inspire and build in aspirations in the children. And in this dialogical platform, in this interfaith platform, suddenly faith and religion were back in the game while doing development. They were laying the foundation to appropriate the secular development work of education that was being given formally as part of the program. And here we discovered that the secular model did not give any value to the role of the family. But both the Christian and the Hindu tradition placed a great emphasis on family and the role parents and the extended family played in nurturing the children. And so we were able to bring the families together. We were able to motivate the parents who felt that they had no role to play to actually get involved in the education of their children. And they could talk about their personal experiences, what motivated them, their personal stories, narratives from their own religious traditions that stayed with them as they fought the tough life as the underprivileged in Delhi. And the development worker could equally share his and her Christian stories. And finally, once we had done that, we helped both the development workers and the community to design a collaborative event where they could draw insights from their traditions to supplement the education, the secular education the kids were getting in the formal programs. So that was our action research cycles. And every intervention we did, every teaching session we had with the development workers of Shiksha-Rath, that became the material that later went into the practitioner's handbook. So once we had gone through these different cycles, we had started to see change in the stakeholders. We had parents meeting, we had development workers meeting, we had children. We tried to find out what the children's aspirations were. One of the little things we did, we gave cameras to the children and told them, go and shoot pictures of success and come back. And they went along with their cameras in the streets and they shot different pictures. And to another set of children we said, go and draw what success means to you. To another said, go and collect items. So we were using children and their understanding, their thinking, and we were involving them in the process of developing and refining a curriculum that included faith as part of their own development. Now, once that cycle had finished, once this fourth cycle of doing the action research had finished, then the fifth stage was now to collate the data. Now, already in the doing of action research, we had set in mechanisms where through evaluation, reviews, minutes of meetings, we were collecting data. But we got a complete picture of the data after we had finished the cycles. We put together all our collected data, we coded them, we made sure that the data that brought about the change we had access to. Then the sixth stage was to analyze the data. And finally, in the seventh, we could come out with an argument and we could write it up. And in our writing up, we had a research component, we had the practitioner's handbook component, and these two were the outcomes the desired outcomes we had at the end of the research. And of course, the third outcome was the work that had happened at Shiksha Rath, which we believe contributed in Shiksha Rath moving forward in fulfilling its vision. So in terms of final outcomes, we help Shiksha Rath to integrate faith into the development work by influencing and working with the stakeholders. With number 2, we conducted the research project and answered the question of how faith can be integrated in development in a multi-religious context. And thirdly, a practitioner's handbook for Christian development workers to work amongst Hindus came about. Now this brings us neatly to Richard Sager's work, How to Conduct Collaborative Action Research. He puts forward a process with 5 steps. The first step, he says, is problem formulation. Secondly, data collection. Thirdly, data analysis. Fourthly, reporting of results. And fifthly, action planning. Now his model of action research is slightly different from the one we have followed, because for him, action comes right at the end. So in some sense, I believe this is more tilted towards a traditional form of research, where you do all the research and primarily a qualitative research, and then when you have got some results, you go and implement it as action. But the kind of action research I have been talking about is where action research itself becomes the methodology. So here you find 2 different models. If you do your readings and look at various other models, you will see that there are many different ways of doing action research. But Sager, I mention because he clearly talks about the importance of problem formulation, data collection, data analysis, getting results. But I'm not sure if his strength lies in actually doing the whole project as an action research project. Jean McNiff and Jack Whitehead, in their book, they talk about 8 steps. They call it a basic action research process. And it's got 8 steps. Number 1, they say we review our current practice. Number 2, we identify an aspect we want to improve, or in a sense, we identify a problem. Number 3, we imagine a way forward or set up a hypothesis. Number 4, we try it out, or that is, we implement it, we take an action. Number 5, we take stock of what happens. We observe, we reflect, we review. Number 6, we modify our plan, we change our plan. Number 7, we evaluate the modified action. So we change our plans, we implement it, then we reflect on the modified action. And number 8, we keep doing this until we are satisfied with the results of our work. Now, at the other end, this is a purely action-driven project. There's no mention of literature review. There's no mention, in a sense, of data collection, analysis. This is 100% action-driven research. Whereas Richard Sager's work is, on the other end, very heavily a qualitative-driven research framework leading to action. So I thought I should set this up for you. Honestly, I'm not advocating either of them, but I believe that you will find something in the middle where both action and research find their due place. Jack Chevalier and Daniel Buckles, in their work, they talk about 2 techniques which I thought was interesting. One they call as ART, action, research, and training. They call it a tool that captures the spirit of participatory action research. And the second tool they call as PIE, P-I-E, planning, inquiry, and evaluation. And this again, they feel is useful for an effective learning system. I've just very briefly introduced these 3 materials to you, and I hope you will take time to read them. Especially there's a chapter in McNiff's book which reviews historically different action research processes, which will give insights. And the goal for you is to design, or at least begin to design, your own action research process, which is going to be useful in your own context. So with that, we come to an end of this lecture. And I want to wish you happy reading of the prescribed readings, as well as a time for reflection, because you're now starting to get a worldview which is going to bring action, participation, and research together. And you are thinking as you read of how you're going to bring change to the stakeholders of the organization, the community you're involved with, as well as how you're going to research on a question that has risen up from that very situation. So happy reading, have a great week, and look forward to speaking to you again next week. Bye now.